What's going on, guys? It's Brian coming to you from the TST Industries Garage. As you can see behind me, I have a bone stock 2017 plus Honda CBR1000RR. Being that it is bone stock, it still has that OEM fender, and as we know, most of you riders are going to want to get rid of that as soon as possible. So we went ahead and developed our Elite-1 Fender Eliminator system. So the Elite-1 is going to come with our machined aluminum closeout, which you can actually purchase separately if you're just one of those guys that wants to go to the track or something, take your plate off, that sort of stuff. You can buy this separately. It's going to come with this closeout, the aluminum piece, as well as this steel bent bracket that's going to be black powder coated to help you mount that up in place of the OEM fender. Now, our Elite-1 system is going to come with two options, being the standard or the adjustable. The standard system is just going to come with a steel laser cut, black powder coated again, bracket. It's going to keep your plate in a fixed position, allow you to mount up your license plate, your signals if you so choose to run them, and a license plate light. The Elite-1 adjustable system is going to come with these really nice machined aluminum black anodized pieces. It's a really nice bracket system that's going to allow you to do all the same things that the standard does, but give you that one extra step of adjustability, allowing you to really fine-tune your plate angle as well as your signals if you mount them on there. So there's not a whole lot to touch on before we actually just jump into installations. We're gonna do a little bit of pre-assembly here on the table and then start to remove some of the OEM pieces. It's a little tricky in there once we get to the fairing removal, but I'll walk you guys through every step. Let's jump into it. All right, so if you chose to just purchase the closeout separately for this bike, you're gonna get exactly what's here in front of me. So it's going to be our aluminum closeout, the black powder coated bracket that I had mentioned, and this little baggie of hardware. We're gonna go ahead and empty this little baggie of hardware. You're gonna have two M5 countersunks with M5 nylock nuts, as well as one M6 countersunk and one M6 nylock nut. So we're gonna take our aluminum closeout and the bracket. See the holes, we're gonna line those up like so. We're gonna drop both of our M5s through, cap those with our fingers, turn it over, and just start to hand thread on those M5 nylock knots. Before we crank those down, we're gonna flip it back over, take our M6, throw that through the center hole, again, cap it with our fingers so it doesn't fall out, and lightly thread on that M6 nylock nut. So the only thing you wanna be sure you're doing when you're installing this is making sure that you're actually putting it on straight. The way that you can see that is there's gonna be a little lip on either side of this bracket where you can see the closeout. So just try to make sure that that's as parallel as possible before you go ahead and tighten it down. So we're gonna take an M3 Allen key and an 8mm box wrench. We're gonna tighten down one of these M5 countersunk screws. You can see the bracket walks a little bit, so before it's totally bottomed out, you wanna make sure that you have it in the right position. We're gonna go ahead and grab that other one, do the same. Now you don't have to go Gorilla tight on these, they're nylock nuts, so you don't actually need any Loctite or anything like that. They are gonna keep themselves captive. That nylon portion in the nut does a very good job of that. So now we're gonna take an M4 Allen key and a 10mm box wrench, go ahead and throw that on the M6 and tighten that guy down as well. So there we have it. That's going to be our closeout system for this bike. You can go ahead and follow along with the rest of the installations once we get through some of the building of the other kits. This is going to mount up using some OEM hardware up in the bike in place of the OEM fender, very similar to the way that the OEM fender was mounted. So let's jump into those other installations. We're going to start with the standard. So if you chose the Elite-1 standard version of this Fender Eliminator, you're going to get what you see here in front of me. We're going to start by taking the hardware out of this small bag. Set that on the table. So we have two M6 button head screws. We're going to go ahead and take our M6 washers, put those on. Then we're going to take these screws and put them through the standard bracket. Then mounting it with the license plate light hole that you can see there towards our logo, we're going to slide that through the closeout piece, and then mount the closeout piece up to the mounting bracket. Once we have those bolts captive there, we can go ahead and take our M6 nylock nuts, hand thread them on, making sure not to cross thread, Now you guys can see we have this optional hole here in the middle. You are going to get some hardware to close that out. So that's going to be an M6 countersunk and an M6 nylock nut. However, we are going to want to run a license plate light, so we're going to do without that for now. You could put that in your spares if you're choosing to do the same. So similar to the closeout, we're going to take an M4 and our 10mm box wrench, doing a little balancing act here. Start to tighten down, but don't bottom out completely. You're going to want to make sure that the bracket and the actual closeout piece are straight and parallel. So to check that, you can actually see that the bracket that mounts up into the bike is a little bit smaller than the closeout piece, so you can see a little rail of each on either side. Once you see that, you can go ahead and continue tightening down, or just make sure that you tighten down and that's the position that you get. Let's tighten one side. Little balancing act again, and then the other. And there we have it, guys. So that's going to be our Elite-1 standard Fender Eliminator system for this bike. Let's go ahead and move on to the adjustable, which we'll focus on for the rest of this video, although the closeout and the standard system are both going to mount very similarly to the way that the adjustable does. All right, so if you opted with our Elite-1 adjustable kit, you're gonna get what you see here in front of me. This hardware is all going to come in a little baggie. We've already taken that out to avoid that. That's going to come in a little heat shrink baggie, so we've cut that open for you. We're going to start by building the actual adjustable bracket system and then move on to mounting the bracket system to our closeout. So we're going to begin by taking our license plate bracket, which has our logo here in the center. You're going to want to keep that logo facing upward. We're going to take one of these L brackets, as we call them. We're going to want to put it in the center, making sure that that angle is coming back and up as opposed to back and down if you mounted it on the other side. So we're going to want to keep that angle up with the bracket coming to the inside. We're going to take one of the M5 countersunks, throw that through the closest hole, and then take one of the flanged M5 nylock nuts, kind of start to thread that. We'll crank it down in a minute here once we get everything situated. It's just kind of close to bottom out, but not all the way. Leave that bracket there. We're going to do the same on the other side. So bracket, angle facing up, M5 countersunk through the front face, M5 flange nut on the back. We can go ahead and set that down. So we'll take one of our two mounting standoffs. We want to take an M6 screw, take a washer, put that on. Now we'll want to make sure that the little lobe on the front of the mounting standoff is facing towards the license plate. So we're going to take this little locating ring, insert that into one of our L brackets, and then hand thread this screw down into it. Now, typically, if you are going to be mounting this on your bike permanently, which we are not for this purpose, you would want to use Loctite on this bolt that I'm throwing in right now. So I would suggest doing that beforehand, but for our purposes, we do not want this to be a permanent installation. Blue should be fine, red if you really want it on there for a long time. So again, just kind of bottom out. We don't have to do any sort of cranking down just yet. We want to get our angle right once we get it on the bike. So we're going to set that back down and take our other bracket, our other screw and other washer, and repeat the process. So again, make sure that that little lobe is facing towards the license plate when it would be mounted. So take that little locating ring, insert it into the L bracket, and go ahead and thread in by hand that M6. Okay, so it's actually at this point that we're going to take the hardware out of the little baggie that comes with it. Now again, you see that we have that M6 countersunk. We're actually going to leave that off to the side for now because we are going to be running a license plate light, and this little countersunk would typically close out that hole if you're not going to run a license plate or any sort of turn signals. So we're going to take our black powder coated bracket. We're going to take these two M6 screws, drop them down through the top, and then take our license plate bracket, making sure that the logo is still facing up, and we're going to start to hand thread in these M6 screws down through the powder coated bracket, through the aluminum closeout, and down into these little standoffs. that mount that license plate bracket. So we're going to take the other one. Now you can see everything's kind of floating here. Nothing's tightened down yet. That is by design. We want to make sure that we get all the angles right and make sure that everything's even. There's a lot of adjustability in this system because it can fit on quite a different number of bikes. So we're going to want to make sure that we get this right. So these guys, you can actually go ahead and crank down from the top. Just want to make sure again that the actual closeout is parallel with the bracket and that those little feet, you can see that they can kind of walk to one side. You want to make sure that those are actually parallel as well. So once it's all in that position, you can go ahead and crank down. You might want to grab onto the bracket and do it like so. Again, make sure that everything's parallel before you crank down on the other one. These two bolts that I did just throw in are two that we would suggest having Loctite on as well, but being that our purpose is not permanent on this bike, we did not throw that on for the purposes of this video, but I would suggest having done that beforehand. So we can now, just to keep it a little bit tighter, go ahead and crank down on these little hinge bolts. So on that side and on that side, and that's going to allow us to take our license plate bracket and kind of center it up. It actually does a pretty good job by itself, but you just want to make sure everything's parallel and everything's straight on. So now that we've achieved that, we can go ahead and flip it over. Grab an 8mm box wrench and a 3mm Allen. Go ahead and tighten these down a little bit more. These guys you can really crank down on. You don't need Loctite on these because they are going into a nylock component. So that does have a little piece of nylon in there that's going to keep it nice and tight. All right, so there we have it, guys. As we go through the installation, I'll throw a license plate light on, but that will be at the time that we actually want to throw the license plate on. That license plate light will get routed up through this closeout and up through the bike. But let's actually jump into some of the installation on the bike right now. We have to do some removal of some OEM components. It gets a little tricky, so let's jump over to the bike. All right, so our first step before we actually remove the OEM fender is going to be to take our plate off, retain our plate hardware. So with our plate off and the hardware retained in that, we're just going to set that down. Our next step is going to be to grab the key. We're actually going to remove this passenger seat here. So push down on that passenger handle there and just pull off that seat. Setting that off to the side, set the key back in the ignition. We're going to grab a 5mm Allen. We're actually going to go ahead and remove the main rider seat as well. So there's going to be 2 bolts underneath the flaps at the rear. So just pull those forward. Go ahead and loosen these bolts up. Those bolts will remain captive if you kind of let the seat just kind of hang back down on there. So that's how I'm going to leave that. Set the seat off to the side. All right, so with a 3mm Allen, we're going to go ahead and take this little tail light shroud fairing off. These 2 bolts are going to do that for us. Set those bolts down in a safe place. Then we're going to go ahead and actually be able to slide out this little bracket. You're going to want to kind of push down on the fairings around it, kind of lift up. You can see that I got that one to pop. Same over here. So kind of push down, push in on the lower one and lift up with the upper one. There we go. And this guy can kind of start to wiggle out. You come backwards with it. There we go. We can set that off to the side. We're going to take that 3mm Allen again and actually begin to remove this main fairing portion here. Again, set these guys down in a safe place. We're going to grab a Phillips head screwdriver, and there's 2 little push pins down here. They're the screw style push pins, so you actually have to unscrew them before you can pull them out. Now, as you'll see with mine, they'll actually sometimes spin freely, so I'm going to take a little flathead screwdriver and hold down on the edge while I spin the actual center portion out. Once that's far enough out, you can go ahead and take that little flathead and pry that guy out, set that in a safe place. Repeat the process on the other side. All right, so with those 2 little push pins out, this top fairing is actually free. We're gonna go ahead and continue what we were doing before when we took that little taillight shroud off. So you're gonna wanna pop some of these sections loose. They do just kind of click together, so push in and down on the lower portion and kind of lift up on that upper portion of the fairing. Start to get some of them to click. You can see I got that one. Do the same on the other side. Start to feel them lift away from each other. Just be very gentle and don't apply too much force. And once you got most of them popped out, you can actually come to the back of it and kind of lift up and back. There's two little sliding lock features right here. We're gonna wanna get those to release, as you see I just did. Now, just wanna pull that passenger handle back, lift that fairing off, and set it off in a safe place. All right, so before we go ahead and remove this lower fairing and this little undertail portion, we do wanna come down underneath the bike. There's two of those little push pins again, so we're gonna go ahead and remove those. Might be able to get them, yeah, without using my little flathead this time, actually. This one did need that little flathead. There we go, set those guys in the same place as the others, and let's continue up above the bike. All right, so with those two push pins out, we can actually go ahead and there's 6 screws that we need to remove before we can take this lower portion off. Those are gonna be 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5, 6. So these guys are a little bit trickier to get to, but if you go through this mounting bracket here, you can actually get a pretty decent angle if you have a thin enough and long enough screwdriver. You don't get a perfect engagement on the head, but if you're careful, you get enough of an engagement to actually get that out. You could press on the bottom a little bit to give you a little bit of extra support there. You can see I'm skipping just a tiny bit, but if you're careful and take your time, you can actually get these out. Go ahead and grab it once you see that it's starting to come out. You don't want to fall that or have that fall on the bike. There we go. So with a little bit of finesse and patience, you can actually get those two out without having to remove this big bracket here. If you did want to do that to make it easier on yourself, it's just going to be these bolts here, but we can get that without doing it, so we chose not to. So with those off, we can actually go ahead and start to disassemble this a little bit more. You're gonna see all these little locking features along this lower fairing and this little lower sub tray portion. So we're gonna wanna go ahead and actually start to remove those lock features. So it's a little slide back action there. There's a little clip down here. You're gonna wanna kind of push your finger on it, try to get this black portion to separate. A little push forward will help you do that. There you go, you can see I dislodged that. Same thing on the other side here. Little slide back for the rear portion, little slide out, and get my finger in there and kind of hit that latch. And then this portion can just slide back, down, and off. These are the last two little tab features that you weren't able to see, but those did just slide out and back. So set this over with that upper fairing. All right, so the very last step before we can actually remove this OEM fender is to remove this little undertail shroud piece. So it's a little bit tucked up underneath the OEM fender, so it's gonna be an initial slide forward and then back and down. So initial slide forward, back and down, over the fender because it has that nice little slot. And you can see here, that little lip that I was talking about, that was tucked up underneath the OEM fender, in which that's why we had to go forward and then back and down. Set that off to the side and we can go ahead and remove this OEM fender. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and remove our OEM turn signals and license plate light. You can take that little turn signal housing and kind of pull it off to the side, but we're gonna actually take this license plate light. There's a little tab there, you just press down, pull off. And we're gonna go ahead and look at our turn signals here. There's little tabs right there. I take a little flathead, lift up on the tab. I'm gonna try to show you guys while I do it. That's a little difficult. So lift up on the tab and then pull back. Again, lift up on the tab, pull back, very easy. And you can just set that kind of back in its original position. So we're now gonna go ahead and take the toolbox that the manufacturer gives you. You can just kind of slide that out of that rubber band. We like to leave that there. Set that off to the side. Grab a 10mm socket and a 10mm box wrench. We're gonna go ahead and take the socket, make sure we're lefty-loosey. We're gonna break loose these 4 bolts. They have nuts on the other side, so you're gonna take the box wrench, throw it on this side, and then break that nut loose like so. take those nuts, keep them in a safe spot. I like to keep the bolts in until we're actually ready to drop the fender off, being that they are still kind of holding it in. So again, we're going to repeat that process on the other side. All right, so with the 4 nuts off, we can actually go ahead and take these bolts out. But once we do that, just know that the fender will drop off immediately. So I like to go ahead and remove the frontmost bolts first. Might want to wiggle the fender a little bit, free them up. Set those down, and then with the hand on the fender, you can go ahead and pull out those last 2. Just kind of wiggle until you free up the bolt. The threads sometimes catch on the frame. There we go. And just like that, guys, OEM fender removed. All right, guys, so with our OEM fender off, I went ahead and grabbed our pre-assembled Elite-1 adjustable fender eliminator. It's going to mount up exactly the same way as that OEM one did, using those 4 bolts through these 4 holes. I went ahead and also grabbed our license plate light. I'm going to go ahead and start that wiring process. Just want to get the wire routed. So we're going to go up through in between these brackets, little standoffs, and then up through the closeout and the bracket. So just kind of pull that taut. We're not going to put the plate on just yet, but just kind of give yourself a little bit of wire, but not too much. Then we're going to go ahead and take our closeout. Make sure that this wire kind of runs between that little lobe right there, or that little recess. We're going to put that up into the bike and take 2 of those 4 bolts that we had removed, insert them back through like that. Take the other 2, put them in the front holes. A little tricky to line up sometimes, there we go. And then the 4 nuts that came off, just go ahead and hand thread those on before we crank them down with the tool. Hand thread on, make sure we're not cross threading. And then taking our 10mm box wrench, our 10mm socket again, we're going to go ahead and tighten these down. All right, it's at this time, while everything's off the bike, that we're actually going to want to go ahead and wire in our license plate light. So what I like to do is capture all of our excess wire, or cut it if you so choose. I'm just going to capture it and then take that little twisty tie and tie it back around. Just kind of capture some of that excess wire. You can cut these down if you so choose, but we're just going to tie it and wrap it around. So the next step is going to be to take our little posi tap connectors. We're going to want to connect those to the back of this license plate light plug here. So pull that sheathing back just ever so slightly. And then you're going to unscrew the bottom of that cap. Go over 1 wire. There's a little slit that you can kind of insert it down in. And then tap into that connection. We're going to do the same a little bit further back. You don't want those right next to each other. A little bulky if we do that. A little bit difficult here. You can cut the sheathing if you want to. I was able to get it on without, but if you cut the sheathing back a little bit, it would possibly help you a little bit more. Okay, there we go. So now we can take the little back cap off of each. So we're going to take those little top caps, the posi tap connectors, and just kind of set them onto the wire, making sure that some of that lead is extending down through. If you need to, you might need to take a little bit of this sheathing off so that you get that, but most of them should come with enough length. So you see that little bit of extra connection there, and then again, we're going to go black to green, so that's ground to ground. Just kind of set that in there, make sure you're capturing the wire, and tighten it on down. Take your time, these are plastic components, so they are a little easy to cross thread. All right, and there we have it, a properly tapped license plate light. We're going to eventually set that down in that little side fairing, but let's go ahead and grab that other little undertail piece that we can start to put that back together. All right, so very similar to the way that this came off, we're gonna wanna take this tab and locate it underneath our fender eliminator. This one's gonna kind of locate up in front of it. So we're gonna come under the bike, wiggle around until we get into the right position here. This is a very flexible piece, so you can kind of maneuver it into the position that you want it to be in. There we go. All right, while we're down here, we could go ahead and reinsert those two little push pins that we took out. Those go in the same way that they came out, so just pop them in and then take a screwdriver and kind of tighten them down so that they expand. All right, there's 1 and 2. We're gonna come back up to the top. Gonna go ahead and grab those 6 little plastic screws. We're only gonna need 4 of them right now, but we're gonna go 1, 2 in the taillight, and then 3, 4 underneath this seat bracket. There's a little locating feature that's gonna pop up into these little tabs here. Just make sure that that does locate itself. It's a little concentric circle. Will help you get that in the right position. So I'm gonna set 2 of these down in a safe spot. Those are gonna be for later when we throw on the rest of that lower fairing. And then this part's a little bit tricky, so I'm gonna insert my screwdriver and then bring my screw down to it and then locate that hole in that undertail. So again, these have that same little concentric ring that's gonna pop up into it. Make sure that that's located. This part's a little tricky, takes a little bit of finesse, but if you're patient, you can get it. Same step on the other side. So screwdriver down in, screw on top, just kind of guide it into that little locating hole. I like to push my hand up underneath it to give myself a little bit of force. Otherwise, you just kind of push the plastic out of the way sometimes. Okay, next step is to grab that lower fairing. So here we have that. You guys remember these features here? These are gonna have to slide into this under tray piece that we have, and then the rest is gonna kind of pop back in the same way that it came out. Kind of wiggle that around a little bit, start to get it into the right position, make sure nothing's hanging down, none of our wires. I tuck my license plate up here. And we're gonna keep coming down. Gonna wanna get to where these little mounting bosses are lined up with those tabs, and then start to look for the features that you can click into each other. Kind of like so. And then we're gonna come to these features in the back. Gonna slide in, pop in. That one actually already popped in. So similarly, pull back a little bit, slide that in, help that little tab locate itself. And then that last one actually did the trick for itself. Go ahead and take a peek underneath the bike, make sure everything's kind of sitting right. There's one little tab here that you can flex back into position if it didn't get itself there. There we go. All right, so we could take those last 2 screws that I set here, little Plastite screws. We're gonna thread those into those bosses. Again, make sure that that little concentric ring pops up through and that they remain flush. All right, guys, we're getting even closer. So we could go ahead and at this time put any of the electronics back in the side portions of this under fairing here. And then we're gonna grab that upper fairing and finish up this install. All right, so just before we install this last fairing piece here, I'm gonna set it down next to the bike. And I wanna go ahead and test out my license plate light while I still have access to the wiring. You can see there on my hand, I have a pretty good connection there. Jostling doesn't seem to affect it, so we've made a good connection. We're good to move on. If we hadn't made a good connection, I'd go ahead and adjust these little tap splices. You could maybe try to tighten them down a little bit more. If that doesn't work, I'd go ahead and remove them completely and try to reinstall them. Make sure that you get a good connection. So go ahead and take our upper fairing here. You're gonna see these 2 kind of 4 actually, kind of sliding features are gonna slide down into that portion. So we're gonna wanna do that first, and then these little back portions just kind of clip together. So we're gonna come grab our passenger handle here, come a little bit further back than we need to be. You're gonna have to flex that passenger handle out of the way and kind of push down and forward at the same time. And we're gonna wanna take this lower fairing here, kind of pop it up underneath if it didn't self-locate, which mine didn't. So you could just kind of lift up on the upper one a little bit. There we go. And then similarly to the way that it came off, the back is just gonna kind of pop together, like so. There we go. All right, last step before we start throwing our passenger seats on and our main seat is gonna be to throw this taillight shroud on. This one's a little bit tricky, so you can go ahead and start to kind of walk it underneath the fairings. This is how I've found the best way to do it. Sometimes that fairing will pop up, that's all right. We can go ahead and click it back down in the near future. So make sure you dodge all those little mounting tabs, and then this is actually gonna have to lift up and over that little rear tab in that upper fairing. So with a little bit of finesse, a little bit of moving around, we can actually get that to all click back into place. There we go. Do one more check over, make sure that all of your seams are connected, make sure that all the tabs that needed to pop back into place did, and then we can just go ahead and take our 2 little push pins. We're gonna throw those back into these front mounting locations. We'll go ahead and tighten those down in a second. There we go. Typically I can put enough pressure down onto it where I don't need to grab it with that little secondary screwdriver. The only reason I need to do that is because they spin instead of actually loosening that little screw feature on the way out. There we go. We're gonna take those 4 bolts that came out of the upper fairing, take our M3, lightly thread those back in, making sure that you're getting good engagement. You're gonna go into a rubber feature, so you might feel a little resistance, but make sure that it's not giving you too much resistance. They should definitely spin in quite easily. Then you don't have to go Gorilla Tight on these either. They are gonna have a little bit of self-retention, just being that they do thread into that rubber grommet feature. All right, we could go ahead and throw our OEM toolkit back in there. Just kind of slide that underneath that rubber band. Unless you had removed it, then you'll have to reinstall that rubber band as well. And it's at this time that we could go ahead and grab our main and passenger seats, reinstall those as well. My main seat, I'm just gonna set right on there. As you guys know, I kept the bolts captive, so I don't have to find those elsewhere. And then this can be a little bit tricky, just kind of getting this passenger handle out of the bike. So we're gonna wanna insert that back tab in and kind of hold that passenger handle in front of it. I'll work it around a little bit, there we go. Should click right down in, lift up that handle a little bit. Grab our M5, help our seat locate. It's gonna be a similar feature where there's these little tabs in the front of the seat. You're gonna wanna slide those up underneath the accepting features on the bike. So front first, then the rear can go down. Lift those little flanges in the back, thread right in. Gonna go to bottom out and then just give them a little bit more of a tightening individually. That's why I like to do them both individually to bottom out before I crank them down. As you saw, that one actually got a little bit looser when I cranked the other side down. So there we have it, guys. The reinstallation of all of the OEM components is complete. All we have to do now is reinstall our plate and we're good to roll. So we're gonna go ahead and take those captive bolts. I'm gonna keep my fingers on the back sides of both of them. You'll see here on our license plate light, just before I install this plate, there is this little piece of 3M tape. Now you could pull that little protective piece of the adhesive and actually stick that to the back of your plate if you so choose. That's gonna keep it really, really secure. This installation for us is not exactly permanent, so we're just gonna kind of clamp it in between the plate and the license plate bracket. So we're gonna go ahead and line that up. Make sure that we're centered on our bracket, make sure that our license plate light is centered on our license plate. Go ahead and reinstall. All right, so I did keep my M4 handy, my M4 Allen key, and we are just gonna adjust the plate angle here. I think it's a little too steep. I want it swept back a little bit more. So I'm gonna go ahead and loosen those bolts and those standoff hinges. Kind of get to a plate angle that I think I like. Yeah, that's much better. And then go ahead and tighten these guys back down. Remember, if you didn't yet, definitely use some Loctite on those. Gonna wanna make sure that those stay put and keep our plate at the angle that we chose. So with that tightened down, this installation is actually complete. We're totally ready to roll now. We got our plate on, our plate is adjusted to the angle that we want, our Fender Eliminator has been installed. If you guys want to pick this up, it's available right now on our website at tstindustries.com. I think this is definitely one of the better Fender Eliminators that we've actually come out with. Definitely one of the better Fender Eliminators for this bike specifically. I think it's a very complete kit. The way that we kind of assembled that bracket to the closeout piece itself really brings it all together and keeps a super sleek profile on this bike. I think it looks fantastic, and I think you guys will want one too. I'll turn the bike on and let you guys enjoy the after shots.